Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov are books that everyone should read. But if you haven't read them yet, don't worry. I haven't read them either, at least in full. That's why I bring on experts like Spencer Klavan to help us understand why Dostoevsky, the 19th century Russian writer who was exiled and put into a camp for his opinions, is such an important intellectual. Continuing our Thinker of the Month series, Dostoevsky for September. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Timeless. It's great, as always, to be with you. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified with every new piece of content that I post. Mondays is Dennis and Julie Day. That's the show that I have with Dennis Prager. It airs at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. Timeless is Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and then Julie Noted news videos are scattered all throughout the week. So please do check those out, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman, and you will see that I am much more active than I previously was on those platforms. I am so honored, as always, to welcome Spencer Klavan to the show. I love every Timeless episode, but if I had to choose some favorites, I would say the Thinker of the Month series is one of them because I learned so much from this thinker of every month, Spencer Klavan. He's a features editor of The American Mind, an associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, the host of the Young Heretics podcast, and of course, he is the author of truly one of my favorite books, and a book that I think is one of the most important of the 21st century, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Spencer, welcome back.
Julie, thanks so much for having me. And I think now that you're on social media more often, we should discuss what Dostoevsky would have tweeted if he had been on the platform, because I think he would have probably had some bangers. But it's great to be.
We definitely should. You know, that would be a fun segment for the Thinker of the Month series. What would Rousseau have tweeted? What would Marx have tweeted? I think Marx would have been thrilled to see a lot of what is going on. Sadly.
Absolutely. Marx, the shadow of Marx, haunts Twitter daily. It's like his favorite platform.
It haunts everywhere daily, it seems. So as I indicated, Spencer, in the introduction, and as I told you before the show, I am not really that familiar with Dostoevsky. The other thinkers of the month who we've discussed, Nietzsche, Rousseau, and Marx, I've read their work. I'm only a little bit into Crime and Punishment, which is a very depressing but interesting book. So I really am looking forward to learning from you this hour, as always, but especially because I really don't know very much about Dostoevsky. But what I do know is that he had a very difficult life, starting from his early years. And then, as also mentioned in the introduction, he ended up being in a labor camp in Siberia for his views. So as you do with all of the thinkers, can you give us a little bit of a background, if you know it, on his early life and some of the more formative experiences of his life?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, I don't know if you're familiar with the joke that, English literature says, I will die for honor. French literature says, I will die for love. And Russian literature just says, I will die. So you're not alone in finding the whole thing a little bit depressing. I think that Dostoevsky is actually one of the most uplifting Russian novelists once you get into him, but he's also one of the most unsparingly honest novelists ever to have lived about a time that was very turbulent and difficult, and he saw a lot of what Russia would go through in the 20th century after he died. He foresaw a lot of that, so it's not necessarily cheerful reading. You're absolutely right about that. His life story, though, is worthy really of a novel in and of itself. You mentioned his exile in Siberia, and to understand what that did for him, it totally transformed his outlook, his way of thinking about life, indeed also his relationship to faith, to religion. You have to know how he had gotten his start. So this is a guy that was never quite comfortable with the path that was expected for him. His father wanted him to go into the military, become an engineer. This didn't sit well with him at all. He was always a sensitive literary type. And as a young man, he was discovered by Vissarion Belinsky, who's not somebody we think or know about too much these days, but at the time, this will tell you how fickle fame was. I mean, guy was the Elvis of the Russian literary scene. To be noticed by him was to have your ticket made. And Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor Folk, was incredibly affecting to Belinsky, and Belinsky elevated him to this position of great honor in the kind of circles that he wanted to move in. And he began to fall in with these sort of young idealist utopian literary types, among whom many of the ideas were popular that would lead to the rise of socialism and of Marxism in Russia. And so Dostoevsky did not start his life out as a kind of conservative hero or a Christian hero even. And it was in fact for that reason that he ended up in trouble with the Tsarist regime. The Petrushevsky Circle, which is the group of literary thinkers he was a part of, got accused of subversive literary activities, of reading aloud from works that were anti-Tsarist, anti-Russian. And so he ended up in front of a firing squad. And it's one of the most dramatic episodes from all of 19th century literature. He was next in line, essentially, to be shot. And at the last moment, the Tsar did something that he sometimes did, which is kind of pulled this grand gesture of magnanimity and forgiveness, and he stopped the shooting. So Dostoevsky was not killed and was instead exiled to Siberia. He would write to his brother that this whole near-death experience suddenly left him with an intense feeling for the importance of life, for the beauty of just drawing breath and living. And of course, then he was immediately sent into hard labor, had this terrible experience in the Siberian camps. But it was there that he came to realize that the grand theories of socialism, utopianism, sharing all in common, that he had indulged in among the elite literary set, those theories were not shared or even particularly exciting to the lower classes, among whom he was mingling in the camps and in the punitive labor camps. And so then he began to realize that what truly spoke to the soul of poor folk, of the people he had been concerned for and written about, was Christianity, that their Bibles, their religion, among the lost and the least, among those who had been condemned by society, it was actually this supposedly primitive Russian faith that got them and that got him through. And this, of course, would change his entire life, his entire way of writing, and would make him distinctive among authors of his period, among kind of the elite of his period, for the passion with which he engages with the real faith of the common man and of the people of Russia. It was how he was able to hold on to that as everybody else around him essentially went insane.
Wow. I recently did an episode on PragerU's book club series with Michael Knowles about The Scarlet Letter. And one of the things that Michael Knowles taught me on the air, which I didn't know about Nathaniel Hawthorne, despite him being one of my favorite authors, is that he set up a kind of commune of sorts in Massachusetts and then ended up leaving that commune. And so here we have Hawthorne, who, like Dostoevsky, is a 19th century thinker in the United States, and he's flirting with socialist utopian ideas. We have many, many miles and oceans away, Dostoevsky, one of his contemporaries, also doing the same thing. And then, of course, the most prolific socialist of the 19th century was none other than Karl Marx and his buddy, what was it, Friedrich Hegel? The first name of Hegel?
Hegel or Engels?
Engels.
Engels.
Engels. Yeah. What? Frederick Engels, is it?
Friedrich Engels.
Yes.
Friedrich Engels.
Friedrich Engels. Thank you. You're right. It is Engels. Got to brush up on my socialist thinkers. So what was it about the 19th century? Here we have an American thinker, very prolific, a Russian thinker, and two German thinkers who were really enamored with socialist utopian ideas. What was it about that time period that made those thinkers emerge?
Well, particularly in Russia, this is less true for Germany, but in Russia, one thing you have to understand is that while the rest of Europe had industrialized, and while, in fact, what Marx would call capitalism, while this new system of economic relations had emerged in Europe, Russia had stayed under something very like a feudal system. The serfs were these kind of dependent laborers, and their plight was part of what people like Dostoevsky were seeing and were deploring. And it wasn't until the 19th century that the serfs were liberated, which of course was similar in some ways to our emancipation of the slaves, which was happened right around the same time, but also caused all sorts of problems because now you have this underclass that has suddenly been effectively slingshotted into modernity. Many of them flock to the cities, and you develop this terrible urban poor who are kind of wandering restlessly with nowhere to go. And this situation created a scenario in which a lot of Russian thinkers thought, what's going to happen now is we're going to leapfrog over the rest of Europe. And our kind of transition out of feudalism isn't going to take us into capitalism. It's going to take us straight into this socialist utopia. And it's interesting that artists and poets tend to kind of go in for this stuff. It's tempting to cite Orwell and say that these are ideas that only intellectuals could ever possibly believe. But it's also true, of course, that as we discussed, Marxism appeals to a kind of utopian longing in the poetic heart. It may not be practically very applicable. There might be a lot of missing steps from here to the promised land, but people that think in terms of the bleeding heart, in terms of the human suffering of the individual, that this kind of Marxist cell can be a little bit appealing. And that's why Dostoevsky is the one who most nearly managed to avoid it, is because he had actual contact with the real people. If you get out of the streets and you just theorize about and write about the lower classes, it's very easy to indulge in kind of sentimentalism and idealism. If you enter into their suffering, you might find, in fact, that there are realities on the ground that you have to deal with that aren't accounted for in the kind of grand theories of Marxist utopianism.
That makes sense that in a way it was a reaction to feudalism, which was so unequal and so stark. And then the desire to go straight into socialism from there. Right. Again, that intellectually makes sense. So you mentioned that Dostoevsky liked Christianity and saw Christianity as a way of unifying members of the Russian population. Can you say more about that? And how does his love or respect for Christianity reconcile with his flirtation with socialism?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that you're reading Crime and Punishment, which I envy you the opportunity of reading it for the first time. You're right that it's not a happy novel, but it's also a total thriller. I mean, it kind of develops like this psychological mystery novel almost. And that the central character, Raskolnikov, in that novel really embodies a lot of the ideas and the feelings that somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche would eventually come along and express. This disillusionment with sort of conventional morality, this sense that what the church teaches is a sham, and that what we really must do is rise above our kind of concepts of good and evil, these simplistic ideas. The Übermensch, which is essentially what Raskolnikov thinks he might be destined to be, doesn't need to be troubled by minor concerns like the life of an old lady that nobody really likes. Sanctity of human life is kind of outdated, he thinks, and he can simply outstrip it in the service of the greatest good for the greatest number. And what the novel is essentially about, the core story of it, is the inescapability of the moral truth, that Raskolnikov thinks he can ascend beyond that in theory, but in practice, when he takes an innocent life, he finds himself tormented and twisted and distorted by the hard realities of the moral universe. And so what's going on here is Dostoevsky is encountering and facing up to all of the things that Nietzsche would eventually argue and see, all of the hypocrisies of the modern church, all of the discomforts of modern life and the discontents. And he's one of the only people, along with Nietzsche, who was able to see that. When Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky's work, he said, this is one of the only psychologists who has anything left to teach us. So the two of them saw, when nobody else could see, the real problems that the modern world was faced with. But the difference between them, of course, was that Dostoevsky believed in the moral universe. He didn't think you could wish it away. He didn't think you could escape it the way that Nietzsche essentially did think you could transcend it. He thought that it would always come back to haunt you. And again, coming up against that hard reality, as he did in Siberia, as his characters do again and again, that was the message he was constantly driving home. And it's the portrait that he draws in Raskolnikov. It's much like sort of Shakespeare's character Macbeth before him, that he thinks he can get away with it, but it's the reality of the spiritual world that eventually comes back to haunt him. And for Dostoevsky, I think it was only Christianity that could acknowledge and face up to those truths. So even though everybody was at the time accusing Christians of being kind of magical thinkers or happy talkers or fantasists, for Dostoevsky, it was only a true Christianity that could acknowledge the hard and difficult truths of the moral universe.
For those who have only heard of Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov by their titles and don't know very much about the plot, can you provide a synopsis of each of those books and give your reason for why all of us should read them and why you envy me for reading Crime and Punishment for the first time?
Absolutely. I should say, both of these novels were written serially, that is to say, installment by installment. And so if you're getting to them for the first time, you should think about them almost like a Netflix TV show. It's not something that, if they feel intimidating to sit down and read all at once, that's because this is really kind of almost like a soap opera or like just a really involving TV show that you want to binge. And that means there are digressions, there are, little side plots, there's stuff that in a modern novel you might not expect to encounter quite so much variety, but that's part of what's beautiful about them. And they both do have a through line, and each one turns on a murder. I kind of mentioned how that works in Crime and Punishment already. You have this character Raskolnikov, who he's this sort of disaffected, ink-stained wretch. He thinks that he's destined for greatness and he can move beyond the moral universe. And the way he's going to do this is he's going to murder and rob this woman that nobody really likes, and she's got all this money, and wouldn't it be better for everybody else? And that's not a spoiler. That happens basically right off the bat. And the story is what happens after. The story is how the detective hunts him down. The story is how he himself finds himself tormented, almost like Orestes in the Greek myth, by these kind of spirits of revenge, and how the prostitute Sonia effectively touches and moves his heart when no one else can. So it's one of the great rip-roaring detective stories of ever, really. Sort of in part helps invent the genre, but the great part about it is that who did the killing. It's just all about, is he going to turn himself in or isn't he? Is he going to be found out or isn't he? Brothers Karamazov also centers on a murder, very, very different, even bigger novel, really sprawling and beautiful. But the main character is this guy, Alyosha, who is the son, one of three children of the father, whose name is Fyodor, much like Dostoevsky's own name was Fyodor. And the father is killed, and here we genuinely don't know who killed him. There's even some possibility, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but that maybe the three sons aren't the only sons that there are. And so there's kind of a whodunit at the center of it, but there's also a spiritual quest at the center of it. Alyosha begins the novel as a novice in a monastery. He's on the path to take the cloth, become a religious, become a cleric, and instead his elder, the wise and beautiful Father Zosima, sends him out into the world to encounter the brutality of life, and that's what he meets, of course, in his father's death, in his father's killing, and in the difficulties that he has to wrestle with alongside his brother Ivan, who is one of the great characters in all of literature. Wrestles endlessly, Ivan does, with the problem of evil, acknowledges God but refuses to accept his justice and his mercy, ends up tormented by the devil in one of the most harrowing and complex scenes in all of modern literature, and we get ultimately to a redemption arc for Alyosha as well. It's incredibly done. If you stick with it through all the twists and turns, it does actually take shape. And what's better than two books about a murder? I mean, it's like, the guy you can't get any more exciting than that.
So you actually just segued perfectly into my follow-up question. Why do you think that Dostoevsky chose to center arguably his two most important and famous works on this same plot, essentially, of a murder?
Hmm. It's an excellent question, and one reason I think might be because murder, which is essentially the violation of the commandment "Thou shalt not kill," is one of the most stark ways to force moral relativists to confront the implications of what they believe. You can be a moral relativist in your quiet study. You can say there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. But then when you are confronted with the taking of an innocent life, especially if you are the one, you the character, are the one who has done the taking of the innocent life, suddenly the absolute reality of moral good and moral evil comes to the fore. And I think Dostoevsky wanted to confront us and confront his characters with that inescapable truth, because the flip side, of course, of the evil of murder is the sanctity of human life. And one of the great acts of genius that Dostoevsky is constantly performing is to show us the sordid underbelly of human experience as a way of showing us the good that is possible. Because if it's true that life can be ugly and painful and stinky and difficult, then that must mean that on the flip side of that, there is the possibility of virtue, of honor, of grace, of goodness. And it's in against this dark background that many of Dostoevsky's most luminous scenes occur, because then when these characters do rise above it, do manage to find some grace, some goodness, some kindness, scenes between Raskolnikov and Sonia, scenes between Alyosha and some of his interlocutors, it's then that we really see that if moral evil is undeniable, then so is the possibility of redemption, and so is goodness, and so is virtue.
What an interesting answer that is. You're right that
Mm,
murder has a way of shattering moral relativism, unlike
right.
just about any other issue. It sounds like, and this is sort of what I was thinking earlier with my question about Christianity and how Dostoevsky reconciled his appreciation for Christianity with socialism. Although I recognize that now we see those things at such odds, because people who are Christians in the United States are very different than people who are socialists. But that
Mm,
wasn't always the case throughout history. But my point is, Dostoevsky, despite his flirtations with socialism and utopianism, he seems quite conservative in many ways,
mm.
or at least the themes that you say, and that I'm gathering from my 100 pages in, that he explores in the book. This argument against moral relativism, sin, redemption, guilt, mercy, grace. These are all conservative, at least by our definition today, themes and values.
I certainly think that his novels are likely to appeal to conservatives in 2023. I don't want to lay that label
Right.
on him
Fair enough.
because, as you said, he comes in a very different context. He also, I think most great artists resist any true encapsulation for one political team or another. But Dostoevsky, we can say this much, has an absolute point of view that he works out over the course of his career. And that point of view ends up starkly differentiated from what would become kind of the utopian projects of the socialist revolution in Russia. Dostoevsky was one of the only ones to see how the project of sort of socialist utopia would devolve into murder and persecution for religious people, among others. In the character of Rakitin in the Brothers Karamazov, he gives us this portrait of somebody who thinks he is sort of beyond these questions of God and good and evil. And one of the genius moves he performs is to put Rakitin up against Ivan, who recognizes that he's not beyond those questions of good and evil, even though he can't really accept God or believe. And Ivan predicts that in the context of this kind of progressivism, is what we might call it, right? In the context of this idea that you were supposed to transcend or move beyond the old ways, not only would conventional morality crumble, but the opposite of what was now considered good would be called evil, and the opposite of what was considered evil would be called good. And that effectively the situation that we now see, where people use all sorts of euphemisms to define things as the opposite of what they are, that's something that Dostoevsky predicts in the Brothers Karamazov. So what I would say is he was really a seer, and he was a searingly honest author. And you and I would probably both agree that that makes him a conservative of a certain stripe, because the conservatism at its best is really just the acknowledgement of reality and the effort to work within it. He might not have called himself that at any given point in his history, but conservatives will love this guy because he shows the world as we know it to really be.
Yes, that's a really important point. I think I fell into the trap of labeling him as conservative because, as you say, a lot of the things it seems that he talks about are deemed conservative nowadays, but 100 years ago or 200 years ago, they were just universal values that transcended a political movement. You're right that nowadays it's conservative to defend reality. It's a conservative position, for instance, in the United States, to say that there are two genders, which I just find to be amazing, that even can be deemed a political point of view when it's just trying to defend the existence of reality. So I take your point and appreciate it very much. Before we
I'll
continue,
tell you one thing Dostoevsky was, sorry to interrupt you, but just to mention, he was certainly a reactionary, which is the word that his sort of critics might have used to attack him, but which I think is a badge of honor, which is to say that he was resistant to the idea that human progress was going to roll over all of its old traditions and move into a bright future.
So that's what you mean by reactionary. I was going to ask the
Right.
definition. Yeah. Okay. Before we continue with Spencer, I'd like to quickly tell you about My Pillow. Mike Lindell has a passion to help you get the best sleep of your life. He didn't stop at the pillow. Mike also created the Giza Dream bed sheets. These sheets look and feel great, which means an even better night's sleep, which is crucial for our overall health. Mike found the world's best cotton called Giza. It's ultra soft and breathable, but extremely durable. Mike's latest deal is the sale of the year. For a limited time, you'll receive 50% off of the Giza Dream sheets, marking prices down as low as $29.98, depending on the size. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio podcast square and use the promo code Hartman. There you'll find not only this great offer, but also deep discounts on all MyPillow products, including the MyPillow 2.0, mattress topper, MyPillow kitchen towel sets, and so much more. Call 1-800-566-6745 or go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman. So this may seem like kind of a touchy-feely question, but when we're talking about an author that few people know a lot about, and talking about books that sadly few people nowadays read en masse, I think it's worth asking because you've wanted to do this author on this show for a long time. I can tell the audience
Right.
that Spencer's been suggesting this. What has Dostoevsky taught you? What is one big takeaway from his book that you have assimilated into your worldview or your daily life?
Well, that's absolutely right. The audience has me to blame for inflicting Dostoevsky upon them, but I will back it. I promise. And
you to think.
Yeah. Well, let me say this, because you're absolutely right. It's not a touchy-feely question at all. In fact, it's one of the most important questions to ask about any work of literature. What has this done in your soul? And it's not always possible to boil that down to a moral or a lesson, but if it's not doing something, if it's not bearing some fruit within you, then either it is not worth your time or you haven't really incorporated it. And so here's what I would say. At the beginning of Brothers Karamazov, the very, very beginning, there is an epigraph, and the epigraph is from the Gospel of John. And it says, "Unless a grain of wheat fall on the ground and die, it remains but a single grain with no life." And of course, the line goes on, but if it falls, it bears much fruit. And this is there, I think, to tell us, to signal to us what the story of the book is. Because as Dostoevsky himself says, it's kind of hard to follow this Alyosha guy, and maybe we don't really feel as if, there's a through line, but that is the through line. The through line is that line from John in Alyosha's life. He begins the story as a single grain of wheat. That is, he might be good, he might be virtuous, but he's packed up in this little casing. His good ideas, his virtue, his faith even are protected against the world by his little religious community. And in order to become all that God is calling him to be, he has to die. That is to say, he has to be cast out into the world and broken by the sorrow of it. And he has to encounter situations that don't fit neatly into his nice little theological ideas. And that's what's going to make him different from all the intelligents, the intelligentsia, or the theorists who would prefer to kind of box everybody into their perfect idea of the world. And it's because Alyosha is brave enough to go out into the world, be cast upon the ground, and die in that spiritual sense, that he bears fruit, that he becomes an even truer, deeper Christian, because now his convictions are tested by suffering and they belong to him in some essential way. He is able, from his own inner resources, to offer comfort, to offer consolation in the midst of this troubled world. And I think that this is an actual practical piece of wisdom. It's something that you have to learn by watching Alyosha, by experiencing it in the novel. But once you do, you can take this away into your own life. And I have tried to, as somebody that sits around and thinks a lot, that likes to write stuff, that likes to play with ideas. I'm constantly reminding myself that unless this idea can fall upon the ground and die, that is, unless you can take this out among your fellow men and allow it to be tested, allow it to be attacked, allow it even to be modified and challenged by the reality of human suffering and human experience, it will never bear fruit. It will never really grow. That's something that I think, is a daily practice, this constant ritual that everybody, all Christians especially, should always be reminding themselves to do. Unless a grain of wheat falls on the ground and dies, it bears no fruit.
Mm. Who are some thinkers that Dostoevsky resembles or may have gotten along with if they had been contemporaries? The reason why I asked the question is what you were just saying reminded me, although it was a slightly different point, but it reminded me a bit of Aristotelian views of the world. Mm-hmm. When Aristotle says, if you want to, although he didn't say it this way, he said it in a much more highbrow, highfalutin way that I'm conveying it now. But Aristotle would say, if you want to become a courageous person, go out and be brave. Go out and be courageous. Put yourself in situations where you are going to have to develop that virtue. And it just reminded me of when you were saying you have to go out and test the idea and put it into the real world, essentially. So would Dostoevsky have gotten along with Aristotle, or who are the other? I like to kind of draw parallels between thinkers, and by the way, an add-on question is, do we know which thinkers, if any, influenced Dostoevsky?
Well, certainly he was a deep reader and scholar of, I would say, the fathers of the church. He was an Eastern Orthodox Christian, so that was his kind of intellectual milieu. And there's a whole kind of host of literary references sort of scattered throughout his novels. I like the Aristotelian comparison. I think that's very apt. I think, of course, that you have to, reckon with his encounters with people like Belinsky, with the Petrushevsky circle, and with the sort of Russian literary milieu that he grew up in. But if we expand our horizon out further, I wonder actually whether Dostoevsky would have gotten along with a figure like Machiavelli. And that's not somebody that you would immediately think of. But this is a guy, Machiavelli, who, for all of his other complexities, is sort of defined by his insistence upon reality, his insistence upon things as they are, and on case studies. And even if Dostoevsky wouldn't have always agreed with Machiavelli, they might actually have butted heads in some really interesting ways. I mean, I even think the same might be true of Nietzsche, much as Dostoevsky and Nietzsche disagreed on some of the fundamental points. As we talked about earlier, they had this kind of shared vision of the world, this understanding of things around them that very few other people did. And it's a very lonely experience to see something nobody else can see. And so I wonder about that. I wonder also about Saint Augustine, who's maybe a more kind of conventional conservative thinker, or thinker that conservatives like. And that's because Augustine has these wonderful observations about the present and the future in his Confessions, where he says, people who predict the future can really just see the present clearly. What they really are doing is they're looking at the way things are, and they're seeing the seeds of what will come. And that was what was great about Dostoevsky himself. He was the great prophet of the 20th century, or the 19th century. He saw coming so much that we thought nobody could have known at the time. And it wasn't because he had some magical second sight. It was because he could see what was really going on around him without being precious about it and without theorizing it away. So maybe, he and Augustine would have had a lot to talk about the seeds of the future that are present in the present.
Spencer, we opened the show by talking about Twitter. What you just said, I wrote it down and circled it, underlined it. Predicting the future is seeing the present clearly. That is an amazing quote. I'll allow you to tweet that, or I'll tweet that and I'll credit you, because the Torah tells us that when you cite a source, you are redeeming the world. So I will cite you as a source on that one. Absolutely. That is so worth highlighting. Predicting the future is seeing the present clearly. I wonder, in our final few questions here about this dear beloved thinker of yours and mine, how...
Yeah, my guy.
Your guy. How does Dostoevsky differ from, or perhaps resemble in some ways, the thinking and writing of another great Russian author, Tolstoy?
Well, Dostoevsky was apt to compare himself favorably with Tolstoy. I'm sorry to say, or maybe this is maybe I'm spilling some fun tea here. I don't know, but the concern for the poor and the people and the Russian people, this is very common to a lot of Russian literature, and of course it's a kind of central theme in a lot of the great works. But Dostoevsky's experience in Siberia left him with what you might call a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about this. And he would often say, well, those Tolstoy guys, they kind of they theorize about, they like to flatter themselves that they're men of the people, but I know the people, I've been among them. And so that was kind of an interesting little spat between them. But at the same time, one of the things that Gary Saul Morson, who's one of my favorite writers on the Russians, has a wonderful book that just came out called Wonder Confronts Certainty. It talks about the incredible density of Russian literature in time. That is to say, just as Russia sort of jumped suddenly into modernity out of feudalism, so too their literary history kind of emerged like a gunshot, as if it had been shot out of a cannon. And they suddenly cycled through centuries worth of literary development in the matter of a few years. And so much as in Athens, there was a period when, you could have encountered Socrates and Plato and the great tragedians and all of those guys sort of at once. Similarly, in Russia, there were all these guys kind of rubbing shoulders, and naturally there were going to be conflicts and disagreements between them. But if you imagine picking up a literary journal, as you could at one time in Russia, and reading through the different little installments of various novels that were serially published at the time, and you would turn from War and Peace to Crime and Punishment, let's say, just these amazing experiences that you must have had at the time. For my money, I obviously want them both. War and Peace deserves its reputation as one of the world's great novels. But Dostoevsky would have probably done a lot of subtweeting of Tolstoy if he'd been around.
I love this. Spilling the tea, subtweeting, suffusing the modern dialect in this great conversation. So finally, Spencer, for people who may be intimidated by the length of these novels and the characters and all of the themes, I totally understand and concur. Do you know of any great online resources or maybe commentaries on Dostoevsky or things that people can seek out to maybe help make the reading a bit easier?
That is a great question. I would be remiss if I didn't recommend my own podcast, Young Heretics. We did do a Crime and Punishment episode around the 40s, 40 years ago. So I'm going to throw that one out there. And I am a big fan, as you know, and as you have practiced yourself, of reading together, of reading in groups, especially with stuff like this, which is to say, just get with folks and read a little chunk at a time, the way the novel was meant to be read. This is something that you can read in installments, gradually taking it piece by piece. And if it's your thing, Audible is a fantastic resource. You go online; there are great audiobooks of all these works. Listen to it and see how that goes. But then finally, I would send people to Gary Soule Morson, who does write a lot online and who's also, got books that you can pick up about this. I think he's really one of the great living scholars on this subject, and he's very, very readable. He writes well and clearly. So hopefully, with all of that, it's maybe enough to be getting on with. And just remember that this is not something you were supposed to chug all in one swig. This is a guy that was meant to be read gradually over time. So don't beat yourself up if it takes you a while.
Well said. Spencer, thank you. As always, it's a joy and an honor and a pleasure. And I just appreciate you and your wisdom so much.
Oh, likewise. It's such a delight. Thank you for having me.
And I'll see you soon. We say this every time, but my gosh, it goes by really fast. The months.
I know. It's like 5 minutes from now. It'll be October. So I'll see you then.
See you then, my friend. And I will see all of you soon. Take care and be well.